Expedition 44 here with Matt and Ryan. We've been on a little bit of a hiatus or break. Let's just catch up. Matt, what's going on in your life?
Well, I'm in Wisconsin for a couple days. This is when we're recording this, it's New Year's Eve, and so my wife and I were leading worship with Tove tonight. And
awesome.
Kids are at the ski hill right now, enjoying that. Things are going great at the Point in Indiana, and God's doing some great things there. So it's good to be back finally in person with Ryan instead of just doing interviews with some of our favorite scholars. So it's good to be back in the same room, back in the shop here, and recording a video.
And that's been a good season too. But today we are kind of going back to our roots, and we have done an awful lot of videos on trying to look at things and saying, what does the Bible say about them? What is the more biblical approach? And we've done this with a lot of things. In fact, our whole church series, which went on for years, it seemed, that was really what it was getting back to what the Bible said rather than what tradition said about something or this and that. And we've got lots of other videos on it. We've got, I think, a couple of them on Easter and things like that. And then I just wrote an article on expedition44.com about Christmas. And this article kind of, a lot of people say Christmas is pagan, and Heiser, one of our favorite guys, has touched on this on a couple of podcasts and things.
Debunking some of that. But also seeing some of the influence or things that maybe Christianity took over.
It's kind of complicated.
It is. It's very complicated.
It's a great conversation. So a couple of our men's groups spent some time working through this, and there's perhaps roots or pictures or implications or all things like that, but then there's an argument for each side of it. And so we've gotten a lot of questions now with New Year. What is New Year? Is there any kind of biblical significance in it? Is there any pagan significance in it? How do Christians, or how should they approach a New Year? Something like that. So we thought we would take a few minutes and write an article on Expedition 44 as well as kind of give an overview video on it.
Yep. So we're talking today about, we're going to look really at the Jewish New Year, or New Year's. And the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. So in 2025, it will be October 2nd, and it'll end on October 4th. And obviously, the American New Year, and New Year in most Western countries, begins on January 1st.
So this gets complicated because the Bible actually does kind of give us a calendar and our idea what the New Year would be, but it doesn't really line up with what we celebrate in at least America and most of the rest of the world as January 1st. It doesn't line up with that calendar, but a lot of the things intertwine or share same things.
Big ideas.
And so there's kind of the observed Rosh Hashanah isn't really directly from the Bible either. It's kind of a 2nd century Mishnah thing, and so there's just a lot of gray areas, and we're going to just kind of look at all of them. And I don't know that we're going to answer every question, as we're really just, I'll call this like a mosaic video. We're really just going to touch on some of the things, paint a better picture, and leave people to kind of their own ideas. And so Leviticus 23 is a ceremonial passage that we've touched on a lot before, and we're going to hit that a little bit, and it kind of signifies some of this. But Rosh in Hebrew is the word for head. There's a definite article, the, there, and then Shana means year, and so literally it means the head of the year. But the problem is when you read the Bible, you're really not going to find Rosh Hashanah in there anywhere. You're going to find some other things, and it even gets a little more complicated than that, because the Bible doesn't just have one New Year, it has four of them.
So we have on the first of the Hebrew month of Nisan is the Year of the Kings. It was a date that was used to calculate the number of years basically that a king reigned for. So it was the New Year of the Kings, essentially.
And you see that in chronology in the Bible all the time, as they say, X amount of years from the reign of this king, and that's sort of how they straightened everything out. And so it's kind of funny because you see the Bible using these words, yet it's still based on something that was happening in the world. And a lot of times I'm going to be picking points out all the way through this, and a lot of times when people look at the new year, they go, well, that's not really God's calendar. And then I go back to the Bible and say, yeah, but God's calendar was based on what was happening in the world anyway. And so again, there is no necessarily right or wrong. It just kind of all smooths into it. So that was one of the ways that they looked at calendaring things.
Yeah, the second new year, I guess you could say, is it's the first of the month of Elul, and that was the new year of tithing. The new year of tithing of cattle specifically. It was a time when 1 of every 10 cattle would have been marked and then offered as a sacrifice to God in the temple.
So this is first fruits thinking. This is going to be, if you're living in devotion, making Yahweh the primary part of your family, your life, your community, then what you're going to do is the calendar would actually set aside this time for you to think that way. And
so that's when the tithe started. Was this, instead of like what we'd consider our new year and like taxes, for example, in the United States go from January 1st to December 31st, right?
Yeah,
you have to pay them by April 15th or whatever.
Right.
But the year of the tithe didn't line up necessarily with the new year that we'll get to on the Jewish calendar. You had a different, like, it was almost like a physical year, as some businesses have.
And some of this is just debunking the way that we think because we're so entwined into thinking of one new year that we can't quite wrap our heads around. What does 4 look like? And so that was the second one. But again, the biblical part of it was to be thinking about your monetary part of your life, or your extravagance perhaps in cattle, and thinking of starting off this way, or like a kind of a reset sometimes.
The third one, which is the one we're mainly kind of going to get into today, is the first day of the Hebrew month of Tishri, which was the agricultural new year. And it's also, as Ryan mentioned, basically the head of the year, or whatever. This is like the actual new year for the...
And this is probably the most significant one biblically, because it actually, you can look it up in your Bible and see those words used specifically that way. And even when you go back to Rosh Hashanah, they're going to, that's specifically going to be about shouting and blasting. And so this kind of is connected with Tishri. And so it's the one that you think of the most. Yet if you talk to somebody in like Jesus's day and asked what the new year is, they may or may not say that one. Their life might be more centered around the agricultural or the tithe or the king or something like that. So everybody thought about it differently. It wasn't just a singular thinking, it was more complex than that. And then there was one more.
The 15th day of the Hebrew month of Shavat was the new year of the trees.
So this one's even more complicated. And this one, if you could find somebody that celebrated it and asked, what about the trees, they would probably be hard pressed to tell you how it all connects to the trees. But if you go back in the Old Testament and you do a study on trees, which is fascinating, maybe we'll make a video on that sometime.
I think Bible Project did.
They did actually.
And so
there's some great connections to the significance of trees, and a lot of this is that
tree of life,
roots,
olive trees, all that stuff.
Trees were a very significant part of the biblical ancestry and how it all connected. And I mean, again, like we could spend a whole video just talking about this, but since the Bible Project kind of already did that, we'll just let them do what they do well and kind of move on. But leaving that, there's 4 parts of the new year from the Hebrew calendar, and at about the 2nd century, they're going to kind of turn towards a rabbinical influence when the Mishnah comes about, and they're just going to associate one word that kind of ties them all in together, which is Rosh Hashanah. As Matt said, it's much different than our American calendar of January 1st. It's much, much later than that. In fact, our year is almost all the way done by the time October gets here.
Yep.
And so the Hebrew calendar, as you kind of figure this out, is going to be significantly many months behind the American calendar. And so, does it make any difference? We don't want to really dwell on this. We just kind of wanted to explain what that means. And so the Bible does talk a little bit about this. Matt, why don't you just kind of read the text of Leviticus 23, and we'll spend some time, just open up to, what it is.
Leviticus 23, verse 23. I'm reading here from the net, so I'll kind of read about what happens here at the beginning of the month of Tishri. So it says this: the Lord spoke to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you must have complete rest."
Yep.
So that's the Sabbath day there. A memorial announced by loud horn blasts, a holy assembly. So this is what some call the Feast of Trumpets, or the Feast of Trumpets. You must not do any regular work. But you must present a gift to the Lord. So this is the burnt offering brought to the Lord there to celebrate. You must present it in person.
Now hold on, before you start reading, most people's Bibles are kind of separated in these paragraphs with headings, and you all know the headings aren't really there.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were scribal notes in the corner, but sometimes they weren't. But most of your Bibles now are going to have a word on top of this, atonement, and then they're going to start with this.
So then the Lord spoke to Moses on the 10th day of the 7th month. So this is a few days after this, the trumpet blast, which is signified their new year.
Yep.
On the 10th day of the 7th month is the day of atonement. It shall be a holy assembly for you, and you must humble yourselves and present a gift to the Lord. You must not do any work on this particular day, because it is a day of atonement, to make atonement for yourselves before the Lord your God. Indeed, any person who does not behave with humility on this particular day will be cut off from his people. As for any people who does any work on this day, I will exterminate that person from the midst of the people. You must not do any work. This is a perpetual statute throughout your generation in all the places you live. It is a Sabbath of complete rest for you, and you must humble yourselves on the 9th day of the month in the evening. From morning until evening you must observe the Sabbath.
Then it goes on to talk about the festival of Vus and several other things after that. And I think
and that begins on the 15th day, so 4 days after this.
And you can keep reading some of that. And if you punch any of this into Google, there's plenty of stuff out there if you want to learn more about it. That's not really the idea of this video. So I can say this pretty quickly, in that when you really get into it, you're going to see that what we just read, the Torah refers to Nisan as the 1st month, but then when you get into Rosh Hashanah, you're going to see that Tishri kind of emerged with that.
Yep.
And so you're going to go, what's going on?
Mm-hmm.
And so what happened by the 2nd century is they just kind of packaged all these things together. And what does that tell us? You might remember in Fiddler on the Roof when they sing the song, Tradition. Yeah. There's a frustration that the way that they lived many centuries after this is going to have to do more with tradition than it actually has to do with what the Bible says. And that was the biblical rub of Jesus' time, is rabbinically there were more laws established by tradition that didn't really make sense, or they weren't biblical. And it sounds so funny to us, like we watch Fiddler on the Roof and we go, who would live that way? But as Matt and I have pointed out many times,
many people do.
In our church,
churches do,
lives largely that way. And so most people know more about theology according to like the systems of man that you've been told, rather than what the Bible actually says itself. And so in this case, looking at the Jewish New Year, what a traditional Jew even celebrates today doesn't really line up with the way the Torah made it to be. They started doing their own thing in the 2nd century, and although it's similar, it doesn't line up exactly. And so now you sort of get to, the American, what we, whether you call it the Julian calendar or just how we celebrate it on January 1st, like that's a long ways from the biblical or even the Jewish version of it. yet the similarities are really similar. The reasons, the things that happen on New Year and how it does. So before we get into that, this is actually a very simple video. We're like halfway through talking about some of this stuff, but let's talk about how all this like happened that way. When did
it get that way?
When did it get mixed up like this? Because the Bible seems pretty clear about celebrating it differently. So when did the traditional Bible followers stop celebrating it that way, and how did we end up evolving into what we have today? And then, now, I mean, there's obviously traditional Jews don't really celebrate Christmas in the way that the rest of the Christians might celebrate Christmas, but they do kind of look at New Year similarly, even though the dates are different and things like that. They share a lot of things. So I'm going to say, like, when did it go south? When did tradition sort of overcome the rest of what happened?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this started with the exile in Babylon.
Yep.
So obviously in the intertestamental period, or at the end of the First Testament, Old Testament, the Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon. And their New Year's Day was seen as essentially Marduk, a day of judgment against those who basically weren't good with him, with him.
And it's funny that today you talk about New Year's and some people know it as actually a day of judgment or self-reflection, we might say.
Like a lot of people make resolutions, and it's a day to reflect on almost like, how did I do on that resolution from last year or whatever, or where am I falling short and what am I going to do this coming year?
So most people know that we're very much into a Deuteronomy 32 perspective. And so for those of you not familiar, which I can't imagine you're watching this and you're not familiar with that, but we've written books on it, we've had tons of videos on it, but a Deuteronomy 32 perspective means that at some point those spiritual beings that were kind of in power to help rule the heavens, help Yahweh, they're going to be kind of given rule over different things, and different people in the ancient world probably looked at those deities as gods themselves and worshiped them. And so when you talk about like Marduk, and they didn't just think it was the god Marduk, they believed that lots of these deities were meeting there, and it actually lines up very, very much with the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Are these fallen spiritual beings? Are they still somewhat under the influence of Yahweh? We don't know the answers to that, but they come together, and what they're going to be seen as doing is at least this is the way the ancient world thought about it. I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but the ancient world would think that they came together as spiritual deities, and they're going to sort of, it's almost like a naughty or nice list of Christmas, and this is where so much of this pagan stuff comes from, is there's reasons why these things are dreamed up this way. So they're essentially every year going to look at the person, and they're going to put them on a naughty or nice list.
The Book of Life, essentially, is the way that they saw it. Is the day that this New Year's was the day the Book of Life was opened, and it was determined whether you were in it or not.
So this is the way the Babylonians thought, and the Jews are going to be ushered into this, and so there's a lot of God, small g, the people are going to forget Yahweh. Now there's a remnant like Daniel that obviously goes that way, and they're not going to have anything to do with this, but a large part of the Jewish population are going to start doing and believing what their exilic people are doing.
Yeah. So as we read there, if we noticed from the Feast of Trumpets to the Day of Atonement, and then even to after that the Festival of Booths, these three are all connected together. It was a communal like time of gathering for almost like those few weeks.
Yeah.
It wasn't just the one day like we have it. And if you notice when we read that the whole thing was about humility and humbling yourselves. And so I mean, that's really good, but the thing is, it almost turned into like, all right, there's this day of judgment on the day that the trumpet blows, and then you have 10 days to get yourself right before...
Does this sound like any theology you might hear?
Yeah, 10 days to, go to the altar and repent, or else basically judgment is happening, because Day of Atonement.
So the trumpet blows, which again, you think, in the way that you've been conditioned, you go right to, what do you know of a blowing horn, Day of Judgment, it's time for everybody.
The second coming, some people tie this with our rapture, and then the 7-year tribulation happens.
So what happens then, according to the Marduk and the spiritual beings, is then that they would, and again there's some biblical connections that you're going to see, is then they would believe that you had 10 days of praying or intercession, that you could intervene to the spiritual deities, and there'd be sacrifices and all kinds of things going on here, to hope that you could switch lists. So maybe if you think, gosh, I didn't have such a great moral year, maybe you could sort of bribe the deities during this 10 days into putting you into the other list, which would be the Book of Life.
Yeah. And so it's kind of unbiblical.
Yet when we're saying it, people are going to
be like, oh, I've heard those kind of echoes of things.
Yeah, and their theology. You're going to say, well, that sort of sounds familiar. Like, man, do I believe that? Have I actually heard this preached before,
Yeah, so we kind of see some of this like in Second Temple Judaism and that too. But I think that when we get back to the biblical text, it talks about, on the 10th day of the 7th month, there is a Day of Atonement. It's basically a holy festival. It doesn't say it's for God to get even. It says it's something that God gave to them.
Yeah,
it says it's for you, and you should humble yourselves and present an offering to the Lord. And remember, these offerings during this time, right before it was the full burnt offering, which was a gift to God. But when you read later, or earlier in the book of Leviticus, it says that God gave the animals as a way of atonement to them, not that the atonement is being given to God.
Yep.
So God gave the animals that have the lifeblood in it. Remember, if you've gone through our atonement series, go back and watch our Sacrifices of the Old Testament video, and we explain that how blood equals life, blood doesn't equal death. And the forces of life, the blood being sprinkled throughout the sanctuary, purges the forces of death. The entire book of Leviticus is all about how, not necessarily how do we get God to stay. It's that God has already taken up residence among us.
Yep.
How do we be holy people and host his presence well, rather than stain his living room, essentially?
So this is already like just starting to get messed up. And so the idea of the new year was that, it was this kind of return to thinking about things of the Lord. Whether it's first fruits thinking, putting things aside, coming together, stepping out of the world, being in community together, all of these great things. But then during exile, when they were in tribulation, it gets mixed with the way of the world, idolatry, even you might even say demonic activity coming out of there. And what they're going to turn that into is this idea that God is judging them. And so,
or even judging their enemies.
Yes. So biblically, that wasn't really going on. We don't really see that anywhere. There's a humble your souls word to it of self-reflection, but we don't get the wrath and the judgment until it's added from the Babylonians many years later. And that's going to actually kind of seep into your theology, because as the gods were coming together in the temple of Marduk and writing these things, what does that sound like? It kind of gets into
Calvinistic election.
Yes. And so where did that come from? Well,
maybe there.
Like you look at it, and there isn't a lot of roots in the Bible for that kind of thinking. Now, Calvinists don't like it when I say that, because they're gonna, they have their proof text, and they're gonna try to show you some of that stuff. But when the rest of the world celebrates New Year's, it's not necessarily biblical, but there's some biblical things about it at the same time. There's some takeaways. So when the rest of the world comes and celebrates New Year's, it's kind of like when we talk about Christmas. Like, the whole world thinks we're celebrating Christ's birth, so as Christians, shouldn't we rejoice in that? Even though there's some pagan ties and things like that, like, I'm going to take that opportunity.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's a beautiful thing that the rest of the world is doing this. So in the same way, when the rest of the world comes together at New Year's and says, what is New Year's? It's a time of self-reflection. It's a time of rethinking what you've done, humbling yourself. Like, as Christians, like, I love it that there's a day on the calendar that even if you don't associate it with Jesus, you're doing things that are Jesus-like.
Yeah, and even the Day of Atonement was essentially the communal reset button.
Yeah, fasting, repentance, self-reflection, return to holy thinking.
And remember, in the Day of Atonement, you have 2 goats, essentially, that are picked. They're both, at first, called a sacrifice of atonement because the lots haven't been cast.
Yep.
So when the lots are cast, one is designated to go into the wilderness. That goat is not killed.
Right.
Basically, the priest does the double hand press, signifying and confessing the sins that we've repented of in the community, and then so those sins, that moral force of death, is basically being put on the goat and do that. And now this goat isn't bearing sin as in a sacrifice. He's essentially a dump truck, taking the trash out of the town. Essentially, is what it is, and giving it back to. It says. Like for Azazel, so that's a tricky thing there, and we've gone into that in other videos. But essentially, the way I've heard, I think it was a podcast the other day. It's kind of like, you know, in like Billy Madison, where they put the dog poo in the bag and light it on fire, and the guy comes out and stuff. It's essentially sending that to Satan, giving him back his stuff. And then the other goat, which is actually the goat for atonement. It's the one time that the high priest can go into the holiest place and sprinkles the blood on the throne seat, the mercy seat there on the ark, and it purges basically the stain of sin, the stain of impurity from the sanctuary, so that basically it sweeps out God's house, essentially, because of our defilement of really just being humans, our moral impurity, the ancient like ritual impurities are seen as like a stain on the sanctuary. It's not as much to do with what we think of, this goat has to die so I can be forgiven, but it's that we clean God's house so that we're doing our part in taking care of a holy God living amongst basically unholy people.
It's actually Expedition 44 language in that we say the 22 represents the best that you can put forward, and the expectation is that God not only meets you there, but meets you immeasurably. It's a beautiful thing, but in order to do that, you got to clean your room. You got to keep it clean and undefiled. And so the word that's kind of used in Leviticus is kapar, and you probably have heard that word. It gets thrown around a lot. In theology, we call this a gloss. And so when I ask somebody what does the word mean, you probably hear to cover or to conceal, and I would say that's actually unfortunate in this case. And why do I say it's like when you know a definition and everybody says it means something, but you're like, I don't know where that came from, you know, like.
Well, pretty much all scholars now believe that it was the Babylonian loanword. Kupuru is the Akkadian word, Babylonian word for it, which meant to purge. And that's really what's happening on the Day of Atonement. One goat takes, the sin, the garbage truck, taking it out of the camp. The other goat is essentially like the ritual detergent, the power washer, cleaning out the sanctuary of the stain of the people's sin. And so it's a yearly reset.
What people often think is that Matt was talking about the sins being, almost laid on the hands. No. And where some people kind of turn with that then is that it was this thing that happened over and over every year until Christ could atone for that. But the problem with that kind of thinking is that God was very clear that he forgave all the time.
And the sacrifices of atonement, the reason why they weren't completely sufficient, though they worked, is because it was only for unintentional sin. And that was, it literally says that in Leviticus chapter 4, that it's only for unintentional sin. what Christ does is he goes further than what these sacrifices were able to do.
Yep. And so in the article, I'll get pretty nerdy with the Hebrew of it. I don't know that we need to get into that right now, but we kind of talk about it a little bit. So I guess what is a better word? We talk about kippur being atonement, and you probably are familiar with that in Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Yep, that you've heard that. And that's where in the Bible we kind of get to the 10th month of, or the 7th month of Tishri, 10th day, 7th month of Tishri. And that's what we think of as like the new year. And Rosh Hashanah has a lot of those kind of things. And like I mentioned, when we get into the English New Year, even though most people wouldn't make connections with the Bible there, what they're doing is very Hebraic or biblical. So when you say, I'm going to, make a New Year's resolution, what you're saying is you want to do something to actually change your life to do better this year. And we think of this in terms of like morality or like, you're going to lose weight or you're going to be a better person or something like that. But the roots in all of this are actually pointing back to living in a way that is more towards what God has for you, and the word for that is Tove.
Yeah.
All things of God, the way God intended them to be, is Tove. So what's interesting was what New Year's does is it's a challenge to realign the way that you live back to the way of God's alignment, which is Tove. And so when you look at all of these, whether it's Hebraic or even a lot of the things that were even done before the gods, in the Temple of Marduk or in Babylonian captivity, or today people of the world that are looking at New Year's resolutions that see no connection between God, all of these roots actually in many ways point back to being more in alignment with the way that Yahweh wanted people to live. And so because of that, I come back to like New Year's and I go, there's actually a lot that's biblical in New Year's. Yeah, there's a lot that's messed up in New Year's, but there's a lot that's biblical at the same time. And I want to rejoice in that. I want to kind of take a second to like just own that, to like kind of like reclaim it for what the original root of it was meant for.
Yeah, and so while we see in the Bible festivals of repentance, and sometimes that got skewed in the Exile under pagan view of trying to get back on the God's good list, because of that. But really, like, the call of repentance or metanoia or even teshuva is to turn around and to change your ways. It's to hear and it's to listen and obey and be transformed.
The hard thing for us is that there are some things that are biblical and there are some things that get really off the charts unbiblical. And so when I start looking at some of these things that kind of came about of that, is we get some reformed notions, some PSA ideas, we've done so many series on atonement. I mean, we did a whole series on it. We've, Matt wrote a large part of his dissertation in this area. We've written tons of articles on it. Matt wrote a foreword for Will Hess's book on atonement. Extremely good. On the article on Expedition 44, we have a link where you can go pick this up. And I have to just say, not because Matt wrote the foreword of it, but we like Will Hess too, but like, we don't recommend things just because they're our friends or whatever. Like, we truly believe
it's a great book.
It's a great book. It's a book that everybody needs to read.
And it's approachable too. Which is good. It connects so many things that, like, you'd have to read like Milgram's commentary on the sacrificial system to kind of understand how that ties into atonement, or these different books on ransom, or like this book on the church fathers, and he kind of does a synthesis of taking all these different things and putting it together in an accessible, easy to read, but with good theology and lots of footnotes where you can track where he's going there. And it's he just did a fantastic job with it.
So as we mentioned, there are plenty of places where New Year's celebrations and Day of Atonement thinking are going to interlace. There's a lot of different, Matt kind of got into this with the goats, the sin offerings.
Yeah.
Propitiation, expiation, we alluded to that, kapar language. There's a lot of these conversations that we could have, but we've sort of done this a lot.
Yeah.
We've talked about the scapegoat. We've talked about Azazel a lot. I mean, if you just go on to Expedition 44 and search for that, or you go to YouTube and search for some of our videos,
Atonement playlist,
or you read his book on it, the more you get into it, you're going to start seeing how New Year's Day and Atonement is sort of interlaced at the same thing, and also how Reformed theology started actually with some of these roots of Marduk temple thinking, and once you see it, we say this all the time, once you see it, you can't not see it.
Yep.
You see the connections all over the place, and so with that being said, we want to reclaim it. So I love it that people celebrate New Year's. I mean, we're getting together tonight. We had Matt and Audrey coming to play at our Tove group. They drove up here to be part of this. We have a whole bunch of people coming in, and we are definitely celebrating New Year's, and we're celebrating it for biblical sake. We're going to go out and we're going to say this is what God expects of us, to live holy, to live undefiled, to kind of be in check with each other, to live lives of Tove community interlaced together, and we're going to remember that weekly and maybe 7 times a year as we come together, and we're gonna,
or at least 4
things like that, because that's the way God instructed. And if you're part of Tove, you know that like people often say, so what do you get, what parts of the Torah do you guys actually do every week? And it's not really like that. What it is like is we're just trying to celebrate and live the way that God asked us to live. It's a return to the Tove way of thinking. Yeah,
it's the heart of things. So really, whatever date we want to, I guess, associate with New Year's, if you're celebrating today, tomorrow when you watch this, that's great. But I think the idea is that biblically we always want to be centered on, like you said, that return to Tove, to God's intended way, and this is a day that really we can dedicate ourselves to that. The way of Jesus, the way back from brokenness into wholeness, to reflect the holiness, devotion, even in tribulation, and how to live in joy. And I think that is really what we were created to do, to bring heaven to earth.
You said it perfectly. It's a set-apart royal priesthood kind of thinking. And it's interesting to think of it this way, in that we sometimes look at the Torah as being like a stopgap until Jesus. And then Jesus is going to, kind of give us a better picture of what that looks like. And that's essentially like, this New Year's kind of thinking. Like, is it better to celebrate it 4 times a year? No, it's better to celebrate it every day. Like, to kind of bring together that every year that we're in community together, every time that we come together, it's communal. And so, it's funny, we talk about oftentimes like the idea of coming before the altar and taking communion is this remembrance of what it was supposed to be. And do you do that once a week, once a month, or every time? Like, I want to do that every day. And that's really what this is like, is our calendar year. The rest of the world says we're gonna set a day aside just to do this, but the way of Jesus is actually to set every day aside to do this.
Every day be a living sacrifice.
The return to that kind of thinking. And so if our world wants to think that way one day a year, you bet we're going to celebrate that. But our idea is to be in community, to be in festival every day of the year, to totally be on God's calendar every single day, and to live that Tove life.
Well, thanks for joining us. May God bless you and keep you.